Imagine walking down a crowded New York street, and suddenly across the way, you see someone who looks exactly like you. Not just a cousin, not just a sibling, but another you. Same eyes, same jawline, same nervous little gesture of tucking. Hair behind an ear. At first you might laugh, call it coincidence, maybe even a trick of the light. But then you step closer, and the laughter fades. Because what you're staring at is not a stranger at all, but the reflection of the life you could have lived. Sit back, relax, but listen carefully. Tonight, we unravel a mystery sealed away in locked archives, hidden in redacted files, and buried beneath the weight of secrecy and silence. A mystery that asks one of the oldest questions in science. Are we shaped more by our genes or by the world we grow up in? The story begins in New York City, 1968. Two identical twin girls are born to a young woman named Leda Witt. Within weeks, they are placed for adoption through a respected agency. But there's a catch: an arrangement whispered about in professional circles, but never revealed to the families who would raise these children. The infants were not placed together. They were not even told of each other's existence. Their lives were split apart by design. For 35 years, these two sisters, Elyse Schein and Paula Bernstein, lived separate lives. Elyse grew up abroad, Paula in New York. They had different families, different schools, different sets of friends. And yet, beneath those differences, something waited, unseen, a shared code in their DNA, pulling them toward an inevitable collision. In 2004, their worlds collided at last. The sisters met face to face for the first time. Imagine the shock, the surreal feeling of meeting your own mirror in living flesh. It was a moment of joy, but also of confusion, anger, and betrayal. Because, as they soon discovered, their separation was not an accident, not a bureaucratic error. It was part of something much larger, something darker, a secret study, a controlled experiment in human identity. And the records of that experiment remain sealed away until the year 2065. Why? What did the researchers see that they feared the world was not ready to know? Picture the quiet of a Brooklyn cafe in the fall of 2004. The sound of clinking cups, the low hum of conversation, the smell of roasted coffee beans in the air. At one corner table, Elyse waits nervously. She's been told she has a sister. Not just any sister, twin. Across the city, Paula is making her way toward that same meeting, her mind spinning with questions she can't even begin to answer. What do you say when you're about to meet yourself? The door opens, and in walks a woman with the same face, the same hair, the same nervous smile, trying to hide behind calm composure. The world tilts for both of them in that instant. For a moment, neither moves. It feels like looking into a mirror, but the reflection has a life of its own. Then they laugh, the kind of shaky laughter that comes when your body doesn't know whether to cry or to scream. Eyewitnesses that day said they hugged like people reunited after a war, as if all the missing years collapsed in a single breath. But woven into that joy was something else, a haunting sense of loss. 35 years had been stolen from them, years they could never get back. Elyse, the more extroverted of the two, was raised abroad and had lived a life of searching, always wondering why she never quite fit. Paula, more reserved, had grown up in New York, nurtured in her adoptive family, but unaware of a piece missing from her story. And now, here they were, two paths intersecting again, revealing what had been hidden. In those first conversations, the sisters marveled at their uncanny similarities. They both loved writing. They both shared certain quirks, ways of moving, tastes in music and food. It was as if the universe had kept them on parallel tracks, even while holding them apart. But the more they talked, the more unsettling questions began to surface. Why had no one told them? Why had their adoptive families been kept in the dark? Why separate twins at all? And then, piece by piece, the unsettling truth began to emerge. They hadn't simply been separated by chance. Their lives had been orchestrated as part of an experimental study in secrecy, designed to probe the very core of what makes us who we are. That knowledge cast a shadow over the joy of reunion, turning every shared memory into a reminder of what had been lost. To understand how two identical sisters could be torn apart and raised as strangers, we have to go back to the moment of their adoption. On paper, everything looked ordinary. Two healthy infant girls born in New York City in 1968, placed through one of the most reputable adoption agencies of the time, Louise Wise Services. The families who adopted them believed they were receiving the gift of a child, a chance to nurture and raise a life from its earliest days. What they didn't know was that they were stepping into a carefully constructed illusion. Behind the polished image of the agency, there was a hidden plan. Adoptive parents were told almost nothing. No mention of siblings, no mention of twins. Each family believed their child was an only child, uniquely theirs. In reality, files were kept, notes were taken, and researchers watched quietly from behind the curtain. At the heart of this decision was the belief of a psychiatrist named Paula Bernstein. She argued that twins, if separated, could better forge their own identities. To her, separation was not cruelty, was theory put into practice. But the parents had not agreed to an experiment. They had signed up to adopt a child, not to participate in a secret study, and the children themselves had no choice at all. As the years passed, researchers funded by the Jewish Board of Family and Children's Services made regular visits to the homes. They came with clipboards and cameras, observing, measuring, documenting. They told the parents this was routine follow-up. In truth, they were building a catalogue of human development, tracking every detail of these twins' lives apart. The records, thousands of pages long, would one day be locked away in an archive, sealed from public view until 2065. The very existence of the study would not be revealed to the twins until adulthood, long after the choices had been made for them. This secrecy is what makes the story so haunting. Adoption is supposed to be an act of care, of rescue, of love. But in this case, it became the opening move in a hidden experiment. Elyse and Paula were not just daughters. They were data points, placed apart like pieces on a chessboard. And somewhere in the shadows, people in white coats watched to see what would happen. But what could possibly justify that kind of intrusion into human lives? At the center of this unsettling mystery stands a woman whose ideas shaped the fate of these children, Dr. Paula Bernstein, a respected New York psychiatrist. In her era, she was celebrated for her pioneering work on family dynamics. Her belief that psychological health depended on striking a balance between individuality and belonging. But in the 1950s and 60s, she advanced a theory that would cast a long and troubling shadow. Bernstein believed that identical twins, if raised together, might lose themselves in each other. That the bond, as beautiful as it could be, could also stunt individuality, trapping each child in the shadow of the other. To her, separation was not a tragedy but an opportunity. If twins were placed into different homes, she argued, each would have the chance to blossom as a distinct person, free from the mirroring and competition that often comes with growing up side by side. It was a philosophy that sounded reasonable in academic circles, clinical, logical, clean. But what looks neat on paper does not always translate into lived reality. For these twins, separation was not a sterile choice. It was a wound, and that wound would ripple across their lives in ways Bernard never calculated. To adoptive families, she presented this as expert guidance. Elyse Wise Services followed her recommendations, deliberately splitting twins at birth, never revealing the existence of a sibling. The parents believed they were making the best decision with the best advice available. They were told this was simply how things were done. Behind the scenes, however, Bernard's theory provided the perfect cover for a much larger plan, because if you separate twins for the sake of individual growth, you also create the conditions for a controlled study of human development. The stage was set not just for adoption, but for observation and experiment hidden in plain sight. And while Bernard might have truly believed in her philosophy, others saw an opportunity to turn lives into data, to probe the nature of identity itself. What no one could predict was the cost. What happens when you take the deepest bond nature can create and break it in the name of science? The answer was not in the textbooks. It was written silently, in the private ache of children growing up without knowing why they felt incomplete. And for Elyse and Paula, that ache would last 35 years before the truth finally revealed itself. If Paula Bernstein supplied the theory, then Elyse Wise Services provided the machinery to put it into motion. At the time, this agency was one of the most respected adoption institutions in New York City. Founded in the early 20th century, it had a reputation for professionalism, for placing children in good homes, especially within Jewish families who longed to raise a child of their own. To the outside world, it was a beacon of hope. But behind its carefully polished reputation, the agency was carrying out a practice that few would ever have suspected. When identical twins or triplets came under their care, they did not place them together. Instead, they quietly separated them, sending each child into a different home. Never once telling the adoptive parents that their baby had an identical sibling somewhere across town. The parents believed they were adopting a single, unique child. The truth was far more complicated. Every placement was part of a hidden pattern, an arrangement designed to serve not just families, but research. The agency cooperated with psychiatrists and social scientists who wanted to observe the impact of environment on children who shared the same genetic code. What made this even more chilling was the secrecy. Adoptive parents were not asked for permission. They were not told they were participating in a study. They were never informed that their child's development would be quietly monitored for years to come. Researchers appeared at their doors, clipboards in hand, telling them it was routine follow-up standard procedure to ensure the child was thriving. Parents accepted this explanation, unaware that similar visits were happening in another home, to another child who looked exactly like their own. For decades, the truth was hidden beneath the glow of the agency's reputation. Families spoke proudly of adopting through Elyse Wise Services, never imagining that the institution they trusted was splitting siblings apart in the name of science. And so the twins grew up, scattered across the city, some only a subway ride away from each other, others just miles apart, each living in isolation from the one person who could have told them who they really were. It's one thing to wonder about your birth parents. It's another to discover, 35 years later, that the sibling you never knew was there all along, kept from you not by fate, but by design. If Paula Bernstein planted the seed of separating twins. It was Dr. Peter Neubauer who nurtured it into a full-fledged experiment. Neubauer was a psychiatrist of great standing in New York, a man who carried the aura of authority in his field. He was fascinated, perhaps even obsessed, with the ancient question of what makes us who we are. Is it our nature, the blueprint written in our DNA? Or is it nurture, the environments we grow up in, the families, the schools, the small, daily influences that shape our lives? To most scientists, this question was tackled in theories and debates. But for Neubauer, theory was not enough. He wanted evidence, direct, living proof, and he saw identical twins as the perfect laboratory. Two children, born with the same genetic code, could be split and placed into different environments. One could grow up in a wealthy household, the other in a modest one. One might be raised by a nurturing parent, the other by someone colder and more distant. By studying the differences, he believed he could unravel the mysteries of human development. So, with the cooperation of Louise Wise Services and under the intellectual cover of Bernard's theory, Neubauer set his plan into motion. Teams of researchers were dispatched to homes. They filmed the children, measured their progress, and filled notebooks with observations. How did they speak? How did they play? How did they respond to stress, to encouragement, to affection withheld, or given freely? To Neubauer, these were data points, fragments of a puzzle that, once solved, might answer the deepest questions of psychology. But there was a flaw at the heart of this visioner. Flaw he either ignored or chose not to confront. These were not lab rats. They were human children, separated not for their own well-being, but for an experiment hidden from everyone involved. The parents did not consent. The children could not consent. The secrecy was absolute. Neubauer's name would later be spoken, with a mixture of awe and outrage, because while his ambition was enormous, so was the silence that followed. For all his notes, for all his recordings, the results were never published. The study, never completed, was locked away, sealed in archives at Yale until the year 2065. Why hide the findings? Was the data inconclusive, or was it damning? Neubauer fear public backlash, or did he recognize, too late, the ethical line he had crossed? No one can say for certain. All that remains is the shadow of his vision, and the lives it altered forever. The study, orchestrated by Peter Neubauer, rested on one of the oldest and most enduring questions. In science, what makes us who we are? For centuries, philosophers, physicians, and psychologists have wrestled with the idea of nature versus nurture. Are our personalities, our talents, even our flaws encoded in our DNA, unshakable and predetermined? Or are they shaped by the homes we grow up in, the lessons we learn, and the environments that mold us from infancy? By the 1960s, this debate was at a fever pitch. Genetics was advancing, but so too was the field of psychology. In universities and laboratories, researchers argued over whether biology was destiny or whether upbringing could override it. Into this clash stepped Neubauer's twin study, a project that seemed, at least in theory, to offer a perfect test. Case identical twins provide science with a natural experiment. They share the same genetic blueprint. Separate them, and any differences that emerge could be attributed to nurture, the shaping hand of environment. Any similarities, no matter how uncanny, could be chalked up to nature, the powerful grip of DNA. But the truth, as always, was far messier. Some researchers have long argued that genes account for more than half of who we become, from intelligence to temperament. Others suggest that chance and the unpredictable chaos of life played just as large a role. Neuroscience of the last several decades points to something even more complex. That relationships in the first 1,000 days of life touch, voice, comfort, and connection edge themselves into the architecture of the brain, forming the foundation for everything that follows. Yet Neubauer's study never reached its conclusion. The twins and triplets he separated were observed, yes, and filmed. Yes, but the research was never published, never subjected to the scrutiny of peers or the judgment of history. Instead, it was buried in a vault, sealed until 2065, leaving only fragments of data and a trail of broken lives. And so the debate remains alive. When Elyse and Paula met, they were confronted with the question in the most personal way imaginable. Their shared quirks, their mirrored habits, their uncanny similarities seemed to scream of genetics. But their differences, their paths, their personalities, their outlooks were undeniably the product of nurture. Perhaps the truth is that identity is not a question with a single answer. Perhaps it is a tapestry woven from threads of both, impossible to untangle. And yet, the silence of Neubauer's locked files leaves us with a lingering question. Was the answer found only to be hidden away? In the first months of life, the world is small, tactile, and fragile. Soft blankets, warm cradles, the smell of milk, and the constant rhythm of a caregiver's heartbeat, these are the textures of infancy. For Elyse, for Paula, and the other children in Neubauer's study, these textures were experienced separately, meticulously recorded and analyzed without their awareness. Researchers would visit homes under the guise of routine check-ins, clipboards in hand, taking notes on crawling, cooing, and the first tentative steps toward walking. Cameras captured smiles, frowns, and expressions of curiosity, as though the children themselves were unwitting actors in a play that had been written before they were even born. Every giggle, every pause, every response to a caregiver's touch was logged, categorized, and compared to the identical twin living in another home miles away. The strange thing is, the infants themselves could not know the significance of these observations. Their lives, full of innocence and small discoveries, were reduced on paper to data points, variables in an experiment that no parent had agreed to. Some researchers argue that even in infancy, the bonds between children and their caregivers shape the mind in ways impossible to quantify. Every hug, every comforting voice, every bedtime story alters neural pathways, affects emotional regulation, and creates the very scaffolding of personality. Neubauer's study attempted to observe nature against nurture, yet the very act of separating twins may have interfered with both, creating a variable no lab could ever account for: loss. The absence of a sibling, the invisible presence of someone genetically identical, left a subtle but profound mark. And as the years passed, the researchers would continue their quiet observations, measuring growth, intelligence, and temperament. Yet none could predict how these children would eventually find each other, nor how the discovery would unearth decades of hidden manipulation. The cameras and clipboards captured behavior, but they could not capture the emotional cost of isolation, the void left by a missing twin, or the questions that would linger for 35 years. And so, from the very first cries and first smiles, the stage was set, a stage where identity, biology, environment, and secrecy all intersected in ways that would haunt these lives long after the data was locked away. How much of who we are is written in the moment we are born, and how much is shaped by the worlds we never see? The answer remained elusive, hidden in the silent, observing eyes of those who watched from afar. The adoptive parents of these twins were told nothing, not a whisper of a sibling, not a hint that their unique child was part of a larger, hidden experiment. To them, each baby they brought home was a singular miracle, a life entrusted to their care. They attended pediatric appointments, monitored milestones, and offered love in the ways any parent might. Yet unknown to them, someone else, someone working behind the scenes, was monitoring another child with the same face, the same DNA being raised just miles away. Some researchers argue that parenting shapes identity more than genetics ever could. The families themselves provided nurturing environments, guidance, discipline, and warmth. Yet the twin living in another home might have experienced a dramatically different upbringing, one filled with more structure or less affection, one more permissive or more rigid. These contrasts would later reveal staggering questions about human development. The parents, believing they were acting in their child's best interest, unknowingly became participants in a covert study of identity, personality, and behavior. Letters, notes, and occasional visits from researchers were framed as routine check-ins, nothing more than support for adoptive families. But in truth, the information was gathered, catalogued, and compared to the data collected from the twin. In the other home, every smile, every tantrum, every curious glance or moment of hesitation was logged meticulously. Imagine raising a child, thinking you were providing a singular life experience, only to learn decades later that your child's genetic mirror was living another story entirely. Some parents later wrestled with feelings of betrayal, anger, and helplessness. They were complicit without knowing it. Their trust in the adoption system manipulated for the sake of an experiment that could never ask for consent from either child. The quiet, invisible hand of observation stretched over every birthday, every first day of school, every accomplishment, and every failure. The parents' ignorance was not negligence, it was orchestrated secrecy, and that secrecy would shape the emotional landscape of these children, leaving gaps, questions, and longings that would only be resolved decades later when the twins finally met face to face. How much of a child's life can be influenced by the absence of knowledge, the absence of a sibling, and the absence of truth? The answer would not arrive until the twins' reunion, a meeting that would reveal not only uncanny similarities, but also the profound human cost of secrets kept too long. Every moment of the twins' early lives, every subtle gesture, every reaction was carefully recorded, catalogued, and stored in files that would remain hidden for decades. Researchers kept meticulous notes. The way an infant reached for a toy, the frequency of a smile, the first uttered words, the rhythm of sleep, even the smallest quirks in movement or temperament. These data points were meant to answer one question: what is the true balance of nature versus nurture? Yet the experiment itself was shrouded in secrecy. The adoptive parents did not know the purpose of these observations. The twins themselves could not consent, and the world beyond the agencies and laboratories remained unaware. By the time Elyse and Paula were old enough to ask questions about their childhood, the files had already been locked away, sealed in the archives of Yale University, with instructions not to release them until the year 2065. Thousands of pages of research, hundreds of hours of video, charts, notes, and recordings, all inaccessible, leaving only shadows and speculation. Some researchers who have studied the limited redacted material released years later suggests that even these fragments hint at striking similarities between separated twins, as well as significant differences shaped by environment, personality, and chance. But the true findings, the conclusions Neubauer may have drawn, remain unknown. The files were not just data. They were human lives reduced to numbers, frozen in time, their personal stories hidden from view. It is a haunting image, infants crawling across living room floors, their laughter and tears captured by unseen observers, catalogued in careful detail, and then locked away for decades. What could these pages reveal about identity, personality, and the ethical boundaries of science? And yet, perhaps the most chilling fact is that while the data was being gathered, nobody considered the human cost. The children grew up apart, unaware of each other, unaware of the experiment that had dictated the paths of their lives. Every achievement, every heartbreak, every defining moment existed in parallel worlds, while the unseen hand of research recorded and measured without compassion. The experiment was never completed. The results were never published, and the files, sealed away, cast a long, silent shadow over every reunion that would follow, leaving only one lingering question: what would we do if the full truth were finally revealed? As Elyse, Paula, and the other twins grew, life unfolded. In separate, parallel universes, each child experienced the world differently, shaped by the whims of their adoptive families, their neighborhoods, their schools. Elyse, raised abroad, wandered through the streets of cities she could barely remember, forming friendships and habits that were uniquely hers, her personality molded by the rhythm and culture of her environment. Paula, meanwhile, grew up in New York, surrounded by the city's relentless energy, structured routines, and family expectations. Yet beneath these differences lay an invisible heterogenetic connection she could not see, yet somehow felt in fleeting moments of intuition. An unexplainable pull toward traits and behaviors mirrored in a life she had never known. Some researchers suggest that even without knowledge of each other, identical twins exhibit uncanny similarities, preferences in music, foods, humor, and movement, as if nature silently guides them toward familiar patterns. But differences were equally striking. Family dynamics, discipline styles, educational opportunities, and cultural influences sculpted divergent personalities, highlighting the undeniable role of nurture. The children, unaware of the study and the hidden presence of a sibling, navigated the normal trials of childhood: first friends, first crushes, first moments of independence. Yet every small event carried an invisible shadow: the other twin, living just miles away, living a life that could have been theirs. Teachers noted similarities in temperament, doctors measured growth and milestones, yet none could account for the silent parallel existence of the missing sibling. Some of the twins' traits seemed preordained, as if DNA whispered across the divide, while other traits were molded entirely by circumstance. For Elyse and Paula, the years passed without any awareness of the experiment, but the stage for their eventual reunion was being set quietly, inexorably. Life continued, mundane yet extraordinary, marked by ordinary joys and pains. But somewhere, buried in notebooks, charts, and secret recordings, their lives were being monitored, compared, and coded into a study that would remain unfinished for decades. And as each child reached milestones, the question lingered silently in the shadows: could anyone truly measure identity when the human heart and mind are split across two worlds, observed but never asked, shaped yet never fully understood? What would happen when the veil was finally lifted and the parallel worlds collided? Despite the thousands of pages of notes, countless hours of observations, and meticulous attention to every developmental milestone, Neubauer's study was never completed. The reasons for its abrupt halt remain partly shrouded in mystery, hidden behind the locked doors of Yale archives and the redacted records released decades later. Some suggest that Neubauer, recognizing the ethical storm that would erupt if the full truth were known, chose to halt publication before the findings could ignite outrage. Others speculate that the sheer complexity of human behavior, so entwined with genetics, environment, chance, and trauma, rendered any definitive conclusions impossible. The study had been designed to isolate variables, to dissect human identity with surgical precision, yet it could not account for the unpredictability of real lives. The twins grew, adapted, and diverged in ways that no chart could predict. Even the most controlled observations could not measure the invisible thread of loss, the subtle effects of separation, the quiet yearning for a mirrored self they did not know existed. The children's successes, failures, joys, and sorrows played out in parallel universes, while researchers tried to distill meaning from a world far too complex to reduce to numbers alone. By the time Elyse and Paula met in 2004, decades had passed since the study's active phase, leaving a trail of unanswered questions, both scientific and moral. The incomplete nature of the study is itself a haunting reminder that human lives cannot be fully contained within an experiment. Every reunion, every discovery, every startling coincidence between twins serves as a whisper of what might have been learned but was never allowed to emerge. The files, the films, the reports sealed and secret became a ghostly presence over their lives. A reminder that sometimes science leaves more questions than answers. And so the study sits, unfinished, like a story with the final chapters torn out, leaving us with fragments, glimpses, and the impossible task of piecing together the full picture. What truths remain hidden in those locked records? How much of who we are can ever be understood when the very experiment meant to reveal it was abandoned before its conclusion? The shadows of these unanswered questions linger, waiting to be explored, waiting to confront the human stories that continue to unfold beyond the reach of the data. The discovery came quietly, almost like a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a lifetime. 35 years after their separate births, Elyse and Paula stumbled upon the unimaginable truth. They were not just sisters, they were identical twins. Imagine that moment, the sudden realization that the world you have always known is only half the story. One moment, life is ordinary, familiar, and mundane. The next, it shatters into a reflection you never expected to find. For Elyse, it began with curiosity and a few scattered clues, a glimpse of a photo, a name whispered, a strange familiarity that gnawed at the edges of memory. Paula experienced something similar, coincidences, odd similarities, uncanny moments of recognition that defied explanation. Slowly, the pieces began to align. Phone calls were exchanged, emails written, and soon, the sisters were speaking directly, confirming what they could hardly believe. The shock of seeing the face of your own DNA in another human being is unlike any other experience. They compared memories, gestures, ways of speaking, and even small habitual quirks, tiny details that seemed to echo across their lives despite decades of separation. They laughed at the uncanny similarities, they cried over the staggering coincidences, and they marveled at the mysteries of genetics. Yet with wonder came questions, deep and unsettling. Why had they been kept apart? Who had decided, and why? And most haunting of all, Were there others, other twins, other triplets, scattered across the city, living unaware of their genetic mirror? Their journey from curiosity to discovery was both joyful and terrifying. It was a collision of past and present, of science and secrecy, of personal identity and manipulated destiny. The story of Elyse and Paula was no longer just personal. It became part of a larger tapestry, one that involved 13 or more children, separated in similar ways, some reunited, others still oblivious to the lives running parallel to their own. The strange discovery set in motion a cascade of emotions, elation, disbelief, and a creeping sense of betrayal. For decades, their existence had been a carefully measured variable in a study they had never agreed to join. And now, standing face to face with the truth, they were forced to confront not just their own identities, but the hidden experiment that had dictated the first 35 years of their lives. What would it mean for their sense of self, and for the ethical questions left unanswered? Reunion brought more than joy, brought a tidal wave of emotion that neither Elyse nor Paula could have anticipated. Imagine the exhilaration of meeting someone who mirrors every feature of your own face. The laughter that spills over in disbelief, the uncanny synchronicity of habits and expressions, and then, almost immediately, the weight of anger, confusion, and betrayal presses down. 35 years of separation had created lives that were parallel yet incomplete, and the knowledge that it had been orchestrated as part of a secret study turned joy into a complex, tangled feeling. They spoke endlessly, sharing memories, comparing milestones, noticing patterns that mirrored across time and space, favorite foods, gestures, ways of thinking, even quirks they had assumed were uniquely their own. Every discovery deepened the wonder, yet also highlighted the unnatural forces that had shaped their childhoods. How many moments were stolen? How many firsts were experienced alone when they could have been shared? Friends, family gatherings, holidays, milestones, all had occurred with only half the story present. The emotional whiplash was compounded by the realization that their parents, the very people who had raised them with love and care, had been kept in the dark. They had trusted the system, unaware that they were participants in an experiment they had never consented to. The sisters grappled with the duality of the experience. The elation of reunion contrasted with the deep, ethical horror of the deception. And yet, in the midst of these conflicting emotions, a bond formed instantly, a connection that words could barely capture. They laughed, cried, and sometimes fell silent, overwhelmed by the gravity of their own lives, the hidden history, and the stark reality that someone had been watching, documenting, and studying them without their knowledge. Friends and family who witnessed the reunion described it as surreal, almost cinematic, two people like mirrors reflecting both joy and pain, innocence and trauma. In those first hours together, Elyse and Paula began to understand the paradox of their lives, the joy of finding each other and the sorrow of having been deliberately kept apart. And as they started to piece together the story of the hidden study, they realized that the mystery extended far beyond their own lives, had shared the same fate, and the deeper they dug, the more unsettling the revelations would become. Could they ever reconcile the love for the families who raised them with the anger at the system that manipulated them? The answers were as elusive as the past itself. Elyse and Paula were not alone in their extraordinary circumstance. Their reunion revealed a much larger, more unsettling pattern. The hidden study had touched at least 13 children, 3 sets of twins, and 1 set of triplets, scattered across New York, each unaware of their siblings' existence. Some of these children had discovered one another decades later, as Elyse and Paula did. Others might still be living parallel lives, their mirrored counterparts existing just out of reach. The sheer scale of this separation is difficult to imagine. Think of it, 13 children, 13 worlds shaped not by chance, but by design. Each was a unique life, yet each was linked invisibly to others, bound by DNA, observed by researchers, catalogued without consent. For some, the eventual discovery was joyous, a profound relief, a sense of wholeness finally achieved. For others, it was traumatic, destabilizing, and bewildering. Relationships formed decades after early childhood can never fully recover the lost years. Friends, families, and personal histories collide with the reality of what had been withheld. And the triplets, three young men who would later be the focus of the documentary, three identical strangers, revealed just how complex the human mind is when nature and nurture collide. Although superficially similar, their personalities diverged sharply, shaped by entirely different households, parenting styles, and social environments. The variations were profound, demonstrating that even identical DNA cannot erase the influence of life experiences, environment, and individual chance. Yet across all these separations, the uncanny resemblances could not be ignored. Shared habits, mirrored gestures, even strange coincidences in preferences and decisions. Some researchers believe these similarities highlight the undeniable pull of genetics. Others argue that chance, context, and environment play a more significant role than previously imagined. For the families, learning that other children had been subjected to the same experiment sparked both solidarity and shock, forming a network of people connected by circumstance, by secrecy, and by a past they never agreed to participate in. And as these reunions unfolded, the ethical questions multiplied. How could such a study be allowed to happen? Who bears responsibility for the decades of unknowable consequences? And most hauntingly, how many children may still be out there, living lives shadowed by a sibling they have yet to meet? The answers remain elusive, hidden within the sealed records, leaving only the human stories and their echoes to guide us through the tangled web of this secret experiment, the separation of twins. No matter the scientific reasoning behind it, leaves a mark that cannot be erased. For Elyse, Paula, and the other children involved, the trauma of early separation lingered invisibly, a subtle ache woven into the fabric of their identities. Though they were raised in loving homes, each child experienced the void of a missing mirror, the absent presence of someone genetically identical whose laughter, tears, and milestones were unknowable. Psychologists suggest that separation in infancy, even for a few months, can leave lasting impressions on attachment, trust, and emotional development. In the twins' case, the separation was permanent, and the consequences compounded over decades. Elyse recalls a sense of incompleteness she could never articulate, a persistent question she didn't know how to ask. Why did she feel different, yet familiar? Paula experienced similar intuitive feelings, moments of inexplicable recognition or longing she could not explain. For many of the other children, the trauma manifested in quieter ways: restlessness, searching behaviors, or an almost subconscious desire to find what was missing. Some researchers believe that such early separations can affect not only emotional well-being, but also cognitive patterns, shaping problem-solving, empathy, and even social behaviors in ways we are only beginning to understand. The ethical implications are staggering. These children were unwitting participants in a study that deliberately inflicted loss for the sake of observation. No consent, no acknowledgement, only decades of living with the invisible consequences of design. When the twins finally reunited, the trauma resurfaced alongside joy and curiosity. They laughed, cried, and questioned why anyone had thought it acceptable to manipulate their lives in this way. Yet even in the face of reunion, there were moments of lingering unease. Could the years of separation be reconciled? Could lost time ever be regained? And for some of the other children, the separation remained an ongoing mystery, a shadow of uncertainty stretching across their lives. The trauma of separation is not merely historical, it is deeply human, echoing in every laugh, every smile, every glance exchanged between twins who discover each other for the first time. It is a reminder that scientific ambition, no matter how intellectualized, carries consequences far beyond what data can ever capture. How do you measure a life altered before it even begins? The story of Elyse and Paula forces us to confront an unsettling question: where should science end and human rights begin? The Neubauer study, while cloaked in the language of research and curiosity, crossed a boundary that many argue should never have been approached. Children, innocent and unaware, were deliberately separated from their siblings, their lives shaped by forces beyond their control. Adoptive parents, acting in good faith, were kept in the dark. And yet, the researchers moved forward, convinced that the pursuit of knowledge justified the intrusion. Ethical frameworks today would condemn such an experiment outright. Informed consent, the cornerstone of modern human research, was entirely absent. But in the mid-20th century, guidelines were looser, and the authority of psychiatrists and scientists often went unquestioned. Some defenders suggest Neubauer's intentions were purely scientific. He sought to understand human identity, to answer questions that could benefit psychology, education, and developmental science. Others point out the inherent arrogance in deciding that such questions were worth the risk, that the lives of children could be used as tools in a carefully controlled laboratory that spanned the city. The consequences were profound. Not just the trauma of separation, but the ripple effects on identity, family, and trust. When the twins and triplets eventually found each other, they faced not only emotional upheaval, but a reckoning with the adults who had manipulated their earliest years. Even decades later, questions remain unresolved. Who should bear responsibility? The individual researchers, the institutions, the adoption agencies that enabled the secrecy? And does the pursuit of scientific knowledge ever justify the manipulation of human lives, especially those too young to understand or consent? The ethical debate continues, lingering over every detail of this extraordinary story. It challenges not just the past, but how we approach research today, reminding us that curiosity must always be tempered by care, and that the value of human life cannot be measured in data points or observed behaviors. As we look back on these hidden experiments, the shadows of those choices remain, prompting one final, haunting question: what is the true cost of knowledge when the lives it seeks to understand are forever altered? Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Neubauer study is not what was observed, but what was hidden. The records thousands of pages of notes, charts, videos, and psychological profiles were locked away in Yale University archives, sealed until 2065. For decades, no one outside a small circle of researchers could access them, leaving the twins, their families, and the public in a limbo of speculation. What did the study truly reveal? How much insight into identity, behavior, and the interplay of nature and nurture was documented but never shared? Some limited portions of the Files were released years later, heavily redacted, offering tantalizing glimpses but no definitive answers. The fragments hint at striking similarities among separated siblings, but also at profound differences influenced by environment, personality, and circumstance. Researchers, journalists, and the twins themselves pored over these scraps of information, hoping to reconstruct a fuller picture. Yet the mystery persisted, shrouded by secrecy and bureaucracy. Why lock the records away for decades? Some argue Neubauer feared public outrage at the ethical implications, anticipating condemnation for the deliberate separation of children. Others suggest he recognized the fragility of human lives compared to the cold logic of data, and chose to protect the identities of the children from scrutiny and exploitation. The absence of the complete records leaves an eerie gap in history. It's as though the experiment itself, once alive with observation and calculation, has vanished into shadows, leaving only questions in its wake. For Elyse, Paula, and the other siblings, the unreleased records are both a promise and a tormentor, potential key to understanding their early lives. Yet, a reminder of the decades of secrecy that shaped their identities without their knowledge. The files, locked away, act as a silent witness to a past that was carefully engineered, controlled, and hidden. And as they wait for eventual release, one cannot help but wonder what truths lie within those pages, waiting to be revealed, and how might they redefine everything the twins thought they knew about themselves and each other? The secret, for now, remains sealed. The story of the Neubauer study and the separated siblings reached a wider audience through the gripping documentary. 3 Identical Strangers. The film follows 3 male triplets who, like Elyse and Paula, had been separated at birth and adopted by different families. The brothers discovered each other at the age of 19, and what followed was a whirlwind of media attention, public fascination, and emotional intensity. On the surface, the film highlights uncanny coincidences, shared mannerisms, similar tastes, and the mirror-like reflections of their personalities despite decades apart. Yet beneath the surface lies a far darker narrative. The documentary illustrates how the siblings, though genetically identical, were profoundly shaped by the environments in which they were raised. One may have been disciplined strictly, another nurtured with permissiveness, and another subjected to challenges entirely unique to his family. These contrasts reveal the subtle yet powerful influence of upbringing, confirming that nurture, while invisible, leaves a lasting imprint on character and behavior. The film also exposes the emotional toll of discovering such a life-altering secret. The brothers, suddenly thrust into a maelstrom of curiosity and media scrutiny, grappled with joy, confusion, and the complex consequences of decades-long separation. For viewers, the documentary is both fascinating and deeply unsettling. It is a vivid case study in human identity, raising profound questions about ethics, science, and the human cost of experiments hidden behind closed doors. For Elyse and Paula, 3 identical strangers provided a mirror of their own experiences, confirmation that they were not anomalies, but part of a broader, troubling pattern. The stories intersect, forming a tapestry of lives touched, shaped, and often manipulated without consent. And while the documentary illuminates the psychological and emotional dimensions of these reunions, it also leaves viewers with lingering unease. How many other siblings remain unaware of each other? How much of our own identity is truly ours, and how much is a reflection of forces we cannot see? The film invites us to ponder these questions, blending wonder, shock, and the haunting reality of a science gone too far. The story of Elyse and Paula and the other separated siblings is a living, breathing exploration of the age-old debate, genetics versus environment. On one hand, the similarities between the twins are striking: shared gestures, mirrored facial expressions, matching laughter, even coincidental preferences that seem impossible to explain. These uncanny alignments suggest the powerful, undeniable influence of DNA. Some researchers argue that such traits demonstrate that nature writes a significant part of our story, a blueprint that guides personality, habits, and even choices, in ways we rarely recognize. On the other hand, the differences are just as profound. Elyse and Paula's divergent personalities, shaped by separate families, cities, and social contexts, underscore the role of nurture. One's upbringing, values instilled by parents, the socioeconomic environment, friends, and educational contribute to shaping how an individual thinks, feels, and reacts. The twins' lives reveal a delicate dance between these forces. Nature provides the score. Nurture conducts the orchestra, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in discord. For example, even though Elyse and Paula shared genetic predispositions, their reactions to stress, their career paths, and personal values diverged sharply, reflecting the unique environments that molded them. Neuroscience adds another layer of complexity, showing that the first 1,000 days of life, the period during which these twins were separated, are critical for brain development, forming the neural architecture for emotional regulation, attachment, and cognitive growth. The separation itself may have been a variable that neither genetics nor nurture alone can fully explain. The more we explore, the more we realize that identity is not simply the sum of DNA plus upbringing. It is a complex interplay of timing, chance, and experience, influenced by both seen and unseen forces. For Elyse and Paula, the reunion provided a first-hand demonstration of this delicate balance. They could see the power of genetics in their mirrored behaviors and the force of environment in their differences. And yet, for the world observing their story, the questions remain tantalizingly open. To what extent are we shaped by nature? And to what extent do the circumstances of our lives define us? The twins' story does not resolve the debate, it embodies it, leaving a haunting, thought-provoking reflection for anyone willing to look closely at the mirror of human identity. The impact of being separated at birth reverberates far beyond the initial years, leaving subtle yet profound psychological ripples that can extend across an entire lifetime. For Elyse, Paula, and the other twins, the absence of a mirrored sibling created an invisible void, an unnameable sense of incompleteness that only became intelligible decades later. Some psychologists argue that early separation from a twin, someone who shares your genetic code and innate temperament, can subtly influence attachment patterns, self-perception, and social relationships. Even without conscious awareness, the missing twin may affect emotional regulation, leaving a quiet, persistent sense of something lost. When the siblings reunited, these ripples transformed into waves: joy, curiosity, astonishment, and nostalgia, collided with anger, grief, and the unsettling realization that part of their lives had been orchestrated as an experiment. Friends, family, and therapists observed the complexity of their emotions. Laughter mingled with tears, fascination tangled with unease, and the thrill of discovery coexisted with lingering trauma. The psychological effects are not confined to emotional states alone. Research into separated twins suggests that identity formation itself can be altered. Questions about who you are, how you relate to others, and even what you value in life may be influenced by a twin's absence. For Elyse and Paula, moments of synchronicity mirrored gestures, shared expressions, uncanny similarities were exhilarating, yet also disorienting. A constant reminder of the invisible link that had been severed and the lost decades they could never reclaim. The study, despite its scientific ambition, failed to account for the human cost. The confusion, the longing, the complexity of lives lived apart, yet connected. As more twins and triplets discovered one another, patterns emerged, showing both the resilience of the human spirit and the subtle, sometimes haunting, way separation leaves its mark. It is a psychological footprint that no data point can fully capture, a human story hidden beneath charts, tables, and redacted files. And it raises a question that lingers with every reunion, every mirrored smile, and every shared laugh. How deeply can identity be shaped by absence? And how much of who we are remains unknown until we find the other half of ourselves? The story of separated twins and triplets quickly captured the imagination of the public, drawing headlines, television segments, and documentaries that transformed private family revelations into a cultural phenomenon. When Elyse and Paula, like the triplets featured in Three Identical Strangers, made their story known, the media descended with fascination, curiosity, and, at times, sensationalism. The public was captivated not only by the remarkable coincidences, habits, mirrored mannerisms, and uncanny similarities, but also by the ethical drama underpinning their lives. How could such an experiment be conducted in secret? Why were children deliberately separated without consent? The story seemed to straddle the line between human interest narrative and ethical thriller. Journalists explored every facet of the twins' lives, childhood milestones, career paths, and the moment of reunion. Interviews highlighted the emotional intensity of discovering a sibling, the joy of connection, and the lingering questions of betrayal and manipulation. Readers and viewers were drawn to the drama of coincidence and the poetry of genetics, fascinated by the subtle but undeniable echoes of nature that persisted across decades of separation. Yet the media's attention also underscored a troubling reality. While the story entertained and intrigued, it also illuminated the gaps in our understanding of identity, ethics, and scientific responsibility. Commentators and psychologists weighed in, attempting to contextualize the reunions, often emphasizing the resilience of human bonds and the uncanny power of genetics. But underlying the fascination was a haunting truth. These families were participants in a long-forgotten experiment, observed and manipulated without their knowledge, their lives serving a purpose they did not choose. For the public, the story became a mirror reflecting our curiosity about identity, the human mind, and the boundaries of science. It forced society to ask difficult questions. How far should research intrude into human life? And perhaps, most compellingly, what does it mean when the search for knowledge comes at the cost of personal history, trust, and years of experience? As the media coverage continued, it was clear that the story would resonate for generations, both as a tale of reunion and as a cautionary tale about the power and danger of science. Conducted in secrecy, it was not until decades later that the full contours of the twins' study began to emerge, pieced together through interviews, partial documents, and the recollections of those involved. The separation of twins and triplets was no accident. It was a deliberate, methodical experiment designed to explore the essence of identity. Researchers, led by Peter Neubauer, had envisioned a world in which nature could be isolated from nurture, a laboratory of human life spanning homes, schools, and families. Yet the revelation of the study's existence shocked the public and the families alike. The hidden methodology, the deliberate secrecy, and the ethical breaches painted a chilling portrait of science conducted without consent. It became clear that dozens of children, all living unaware of one another, had been subjected to careful observation and documentation. Some had been reunited, while others remained oblivious, their lives parallel but unseen. The revelations prompted discussions in psychological, scientific, and ethical circles, with experts debating the implications. Could such a study ever be justified? Did the potential for knowledge outweigh the personal costs inflicted on innocent lives? Partial records released later showed meticulous notes, developmental milestones, personality assessments, and subtle comparisons between siblings. Yet the redactions and gaps left more questions than answers, leaving researchers and the public to speculate on the conclusions Neubauer may have drawn. The twins' experiences, both joyous and traumatic, became a lens through which the study could be interpreted, offering real-world insight into the theoretical questions that had motivated decades of research. Elyse and Paula, like the triplets, were living proof of both the power of genetics and the shaping hand of environment, a testament to what the study sought to explore, yet simultaneously a reminder of the human cost behind the data. As more details surfaced, the story became a cautionary tale, a dramatic narrative of identity, ethics, and scientific ambition. And the lingering question persisted: if the records were finally fully revealed, what truths would emerge, and how would they reshape our understanding of human development and the lives of those who had been unknowingly studied? One of the most striking revelations from the story of Elyse, Paula, and the other separated siblings is the undeniable power of genetics. Despite decades apart, the twins exhibited uncanny similarities that could not be easily explained by chance. Alone, habits, preferences, speech patterns, and even subtle gestures appeared mirrored across the divide, as if nature had imprinted them with an invisible hand. Some researchers argue that these parallels demonstrate the profound influence of DNA in shaping personality, behavior, and identity. Studies of identical twins have long suggested that traits such as temperament, intelligence, and predispositions toward certain behaviors may be inherited, highlighting the unseen threads that connect us to our genetic blueprint. Yet, the story of separated twins also shows the limits of genetics. Environment, upbringing, and life experiences played a powerful role in shaping differences between siblings. One twin might thrive in a structured, disciplined household, while another develops creativity and resilience in a more permissive environment. These contrasts underscore that while genetics lays the foundation, it is life's circumstances that build the structure. For Elyse and Paula, the role of genetics was both astonishing and deeply personal. Shared quirks, mirrored reactions, and familiar instincts provided a sense of connection and recognition, confirming that biology carries echoes of the self across time and space. But alongside this revelation came a humbling acknowledgement of nurture's influence, the ways in which their distinct experiences molded their personalities, decisions, and worldviews. The twin study, though ethically questionable, inadvertently highlighted the delicate balance between nature and nurture, showing that identity is neither entirely inherited nor solely formed by environment. For the twins, every mirrored smile or shared preference became a living testament to genetics, a reminder of the invisible threads that bind human lives together, even when separated. And yet, the question persists: just how much of who we are is predetermined, and how much is forged in the unpredictable crucible of life? The answers remain tantalizingly elusive, hidden within the intersection of DNA, experience, and the silent forces that shape our humanity. Reuniting with a sibling is only one part of the journey. The twins also confronted the families who had raised them, people who had nurtured, guided, and loved them without ever knowing the full story. Elyse and Paula met not only each other, but also the parents who had unknowingly participated in the study, discovering decades of hidden truth. In the process, imagine the mix of emotions: gratitude for a loving upbringing, confusion over the secrets that had been kept, and a quiet, simmering anger toward the system that manipulated their lives. For some adoptive parents, the revelation was shocking. They had believed they were simply giving a child a home, only to realize that the child's life was being compared, studied, and observed as part of an experiment. Some experienced guilt, wondering whether unknowingly participating made them complicit, while others focused on the joy of seeing their child reunited with a twin they had never imagined. These reunions were complex, emotionally charged events, blending love, grief, curiosity, and sometimes resentment. The children had grown into adults with careers, families, and identities shaped by their unique experiences. Yet the existence of a genetic mirror challenged every assumption about who they were. The interactions with adoptive families also illuminated the ethical gray areas of the study. Parents trusted adoption agencies, never questioning why such a decision to separate twins was deemed appropriate. Through conversations, shared stories, and emotional encounters, Elyse and Paula began to reconcile the two halves of their lives, the world they knew, and the hidden world of genetic kinship. The reunions highlighted the enduring bonds of family, the resilience of human connection, and the complexities of emotions when truth emerges after decades of absence. And as each story unfolded, one truth became undeniable: identity, love, and belonging are not defined solely by DNA, yet neither can they ignore the invisible threads of kinship that run deep. The question that lingered after every embrace was haunting and unanswerable. How do you measure a life lived half in shadow? And how do you navigate a family suddenly larger than you ever imagined? The moment Elyse and Paula's story reached the media, the world took notice. Headlines splashed across newspapers, television segments ran stories of uncanny coincidences, and social media buzzed with curiosity, shock, and fascination. For many, the story seemed almost fictional. Identical twins separated at birth, living parallel lives only to discover one another decades later. The public marveled at the mirrored quirks, gestures, and even choices that appeared between the sisters, seeing in their reunion a real-life testament to the power of genetics. Yet beneath the fascination lurked ethical outrage. Critics questioned how such an experiment could have been allowed, how children could have been manipulated without consent, and why adoptive parents were kept unaware. The story became more than a human interest. It became a mirror reflecting society's complex relationship with science, curiosity, and morality. Psychologists and ethicists weighed in, debating the implications of a study that intentionally created separation and observed the consequences. The narrative captured imaginations worldwide, inspiring documentaries, podcasts, and scholarly discussions, each probing the mysteries of identity and the limits of scientific experimentation. For the twins, media attention was both validating and overwhelming. They were celebrated for their resilience and courage, yet they also had to navigate the intrusion of cameras, questions, and public scrutiny while processing their own emotions. Fans and followers were captivated by the idea that identity could be dissected through nature and nurture. While many struggled to reconcile the joyous discovery of reunion with the haunting context of decades-long manipulation, the story prompted society to ask profound questions. What is the price of knowledge, and how far should science intrude into human life? And even as Elyse and Paula shared their journey, the shadows of the unseen study and the unreleased records lingered, reminding the world that the full truth remained locked away. The fascination was universal, the questions unending, and the story far from finished, a narrative that would continue to provoke curiosity, wonder, and moral reflection for years to come. Meeting one's identical twin is not just a reunion. It is a confrontation with the very essence of identity. For Elyse and Paula, the encounter was both exhilarating and disorienting. How much of who they were was truly their own, and how much reflected the hidden influence of a genetic counterpart? Shared gestures, mirrored smiles, and uncanny instincts prompted moments of awe and unease. Yet their differences were equally striking. Preferences, values, and life choices diverged in ways that highlighted the shaping hand of environment, culture, and circumstance. The twin story forces a deeper contemplation of what identity truly is. Is it a product of DNA, preordained and inscribed at birth, or is it sculpted by experience, nurtured through relationships, and shaped by the subtle forces of upbringing? Perhaps it is both, entwined in a delicate, invisible dance that we rarely perceive until confronted with a mirror image of ourselves. Psychologists studying separated twins have long noted that discovering a sibling can provoke existential reflection. Sudden awareness of traits once thought unique, glimpses of potential paths not taken, and the emotional resonance of having a genetic echo in the world. For Elyse and Paula, these reflections were intensified by the knowledge that their lives had been silently monitored, documented, and compared without consent, adding layers of complexity to their understanding of self. They found themselves questioning not only their past, but also the mechanisms of personality, choice, and resilience. Their reunion illuminated the paradoxical nature of identity, the familiar and the foreign coexisting within a single shared humanity. And as they navigated this emotional landscape, one question lingered persistently. How do we define ourselves when a mirror of our being exists elsewhere, shaped by forces we cannot fully control, and observed by a world that once decided we were part of an experiment? In the quiet moments of reflection, the twins recognized a profound truth. Identity is both fragile and resilient, elusive and tangible, a mystery that no study, however meticulous, can ever completely unravel. Meeting one's identical twin is not just a reunion. It is a confrontation with the very essence of identity. For Elyse and Paula, the encounter was both exhilarating and disorienting. How much of who they were was truly their own, and how much reflected the hidden influence of a genetic counterpart? Shared gestures, mirrored smiles, and uncanny instincts prompted moments of awe and unease. Yet their differences were equally striking. Preferences, values, and life choices diverged in ways that highlighted the shaping hand of environment, culture, and circumstance. The twins' story forces a deeper contemplation of what identity truly is. Is it a product of DNA, preordained and inscribed at birth, or is it sculpted by experience, nurtured through relationships, and shaped by the subtle forces of upbringing? Perhaps it is both, entwined in a delicate, invisible dance that we rarely perceive until confronted with a mirror image of ourselves. Psychologists studying separated twins have long noted that discovering a sibling can provoke existential reflection, sudden awareness of traits once thought unique, glimpses of potential paths not taken, and the emotional resonance of having a genetic echo in the world. For Elyse and Paula, these reflections were intensified by the knowledge that their lives had been silently monitored, documented, and compared without consent, adding layers of complexity to their understanding of self. They found themselves questioning not only their past, but also the mechanisms of personality, choice, and resilience. Their reunion illuminated the paradoxical nature of identity, the familiar and the foreign coexisting within a single shared humanity. And as they navigated this emotional landscape, one question lingered persistently. How do we define ourselves when a mirror of our being exists elsewhere, shaped by forces we cannot fully control, and observed by a world that once decided we were part of an experiment? In the quiet moments of reflection, the twins recognized a profound truth. Identity is both fragile and resilient, elusive and tangible, a mystery that no study, however meticulous, can ever completely unravel. Even after reunion, even after the emotional whirlwind of discovery, the questions remain heavy and persistent. How many twins and triplets never learned of one another? How many lives were quietly shaped, twisted, or constrained by the invisible hand of a secret study? And beyond the individual stories, a broader mystery looms. Can human behavior ever truly be dissected into neat categories of nature versus nurture? The Neubauer study, despite its incomplete and secretive nature, offers tantalizing glimpses but no definitive answers, leaving researchers and the public suspended in uncertainty. Each twin discovered echoes of themselves in another, yet also saw the divergence that environment instilled, proof that identity is neither simple nor predictable. For Elyse and Paula, every coincidence, every shared gesture, every mirrored choice raises questions about the interplay between genetics, upbringing, and chance. Could they have predicted these similarities? Could they have avoided the differences? And more hauntingly, could the researchers ever have truly understood the complexity of lives they attempted to quantify? Beyond scientific curiosity, the lingering questions touch on morality and human cost. How should history judge those who orchestrated these separations? Can the past ever be reconciled with the present? The story also provokes reflection on personal identity in a broader sense. How much of who we are is innate, and how much is shaped by circumstances we cannot control? In every laugh shared between the twins, every parallel choice uncovered, and every story of reunion among other separated siblings, the unanswered questions resonate, a subtle hum in the background of human experience. And so, as we sit back, consider the lives quietly altered, and marvel at the coincidences that echo across decades, the mystery remains profound. What does it truly mean to know oneself, and how much of that knowledge depends on discovering the mirror hidden somewhere else in the world? Today, the story of Elyse, Paula, and the other twins resonates beyond the headlines and documentaries, sparking reflection on science, ethics, and the enduring mysteries of identity. Modern researchers examine their story not just as a case study in genetics, but as a profound lesson on the consequences of human experimentation. Advances in neuroscience suggest that the first 1,000 days of life critical for brain development are profoundly influenced by relationships, attachment, and early environment. The separation of twins during this crucial period may have shaped personality, emotional regulation, and social connection in ways the original researchers could not predict. Psychologists, ethicists, and adoptive communities continue to debate the balance between curiosity and morality, often citing Elyse and Paula's story as a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, the twins themselves have become voices for awareness, sharing insights into the emotional and psychological complexities of reunion, identity, and family. Their reflections highlight not only the resilience of human connection, but also the delicate interplay of genetics and environment that defines who we are. For society, their story provokes deeper questions. What obligations do we have to ensure ethical oversight in research? How do we reconcile scientific discovery with human dignity and consent? And, at a personal level, it asks each of us to consider the invisible force, epigenetic, environmental, and circumstantial, that shape our own identities in ways we may never fully understand. As more stories of reunited twins and triplets emerge, the conversation shifts from sensational revelation to sober reflection, illustrating both the wonder of human connection and the haunting consequences of hidden manipulation. The past, though, shadowed by secrecy, continues to inform modern understanding, reminding us that identity is a complex mosaic, influenced by forces seen and unseen, and that even in the age of science, the human heart and mind remain mysteries waiting to be explored. The story endures, compelling us to ask, in the pursuit of knowledge, what lines should never be crossed, and how do we honor the lives that science touches? The search for answers has become a lifelong journey for Elyse, Paula, and the other siblings affected by the Neubauer study. They have scoured archives, reached out to adoption agencies, and petitioned institutions like Yale and the Jewish Board of Family and Children's Services for access to the sealed records. Each discovery, each fragment of information offers glimpses into the hidden machinery that shaped their earliest years. Yet, much remains locked away, heavily redacted, or lost to time, leaving the full scope of the study shrouded in mystery. The search is both scientific and personal, an attempt to reconcile identity with the forces that silently influenced it. Some researchers hope the released records will illuminate the interplay of genetics and environment, providing rare insights into human development from infancy onward. Others are interested in the ethical implications, examining how a secretive study of this magnitude could occur and what safeguards are necessary to prevent similar breaches in the future. For the twins and triplets, the search is also about closure, understanding the why behind a separation that shaped decades of their lives. Every lead prompts reflection. Could the missing data reveal patterns, coincidences, or even answers? Two questions they didn't know they were asking. Yet the pursuit is tempered by the knowledge that some mysteries may never be fully resolved. Human lives, after all, cannot be perfectly mapped or predicted. The search for answers becomes a meditation on the limits of knowledge, the power of curiosity, and the delicate boundary between science and humanity. And as they navigate archives, interviews, and their own memories, the question remains, when the full story is finally revealed, will it bring clarity, closure, or only deeper mysteries? The search continues, a quiet, persistent echo of a story that refuses to be contained by time, ethics, or secrecy. Amidst the meticulous planning, observation, and separation, one of the most profound forces at play in the lives of Elyse, Paula, and the other siblings is chance. Chance encounters, seemingly trivial coincidences, and the randomness of upbringing, all left indelible marks on who they became. Had Elyse's adoptive family moved to a different neighborhood, or had Paula enrolled in another school, the subtle synchronicities that drew them together may never have been noticed. These small, unpredictable events shaped their social circles, careers, and even personalities in ways the study could not control. Scientists acknowledge that while genetics provides a blueprint and environment sets the stage, it is the chaotic interplay of chance that often writes the final story. For the twins, it was chance that allowed them to connect decades later, forgotten photograph. A casual conversation, a moment of curiosity that unraveled the secret and brought them face to face with each other. The influence of chance is both liberating and unsettling. It suggests that no study, no matter how controlled, can fully predict the course of human life. It also underscores the fragility and beauty of human connection, that a single coincidence can alter the trajectory of an entire life. As Elyse and Paula reflect on the decades of their separate experiences, they recognize how much of their identity was shaped by forces entirely beyond their control, both visible and invisible. In a way, chance becomes the ultimate equalizer, reminding us that life is never fully predetermined, and that the extraordinary moments, reunions, discoveries, and connections merge not only from design, but from the unpredictable, often invisible currents of fate. And so, the story leaves us with a lingering question. How much of our own lives are guided by intention, and how much are the invisible ripples of chance, shaping us in ways we may never fully understand? The Neubauer twin study leaves a legacy that is both haunting and instructive, echoing across decades of scientific inquiry, ethical debate, and human experience. Its shadow touches not only the lives of Elyse, Paula, and the other siblings, but also the broader discourse on what science can and cannot claim the right to do. The experiment illuminated profound truths about genetics, identity, and human behavior, revealing how deeply DNA can shape traits, habits, and personality. Yet, it simultaneously exposed the high cost of secrecy, manipulation, and the deliberate separation of children. The legacy is complicated. On one hand, the study provides rare insights into the nature versus nurture debate, a dataset of human lives observed from infancy with painstaking detail. On the other, it serves as a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that ethical boundaries are not abstract. They carry tangible consequences for real human lives. Families, researchers, and the public continue to wrestle with the moral dilemmas it presents, questioning how curiosity, ambition, and the pursuit of knowledge intersect with responsibility, consent, and the sanctity of childhood. For the twins, the legacy is deeply personal, manifesting in the joy of reunion, the trauma of lost time, and the ongoing quest for understanding. It also sparks reflection on the resilience of human connection, the ways in which identity emerges from both biology and experience, and the unpredictable forces, chance, coincidence, and circumstance that shape lives. As we look back on the study from a modern perspective, it challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths that science, when untempered by ethics, can intrude upon the most intimate corners of life, and that the cost of discovery can sometimes be borne by those least able to consent. The story remains unresolved in many ways, but its echoes linger, a reminder of the extraordinary, often fragile interplay between knowledge, morality, and the human heart. And as we consider its legacy, we are left with one final, haunting reflection. What lessons can be drawn when the pursuit of truth collides with the unpredictable, untamed complexity of life itself? Even decades after their reunions, the story of Elyse, Paula, and the other separated siblings remains an enduring mystery, one that refuses to be fully unraveled. The sealed records, the redacted documents, and the fragmented histories leave gaps that invite speculation, wonder, and reflection. The twins' lives, marked by parallel experiences, shared traits, and divergent paths, continue to provoke questions about the very nature of human identity. How much of who we are is written in our DNA? How much is sculpted by the hands of environment, circumstance, and chance? And perhaps most hauntingly, how many stories remain hidden? Siblings still unaware of each other, lives shaped by secrecy, and a past they did not choose. The enduring mystery is both scientific and profoundly human. It reminds us that identity cannot be neatly dissected, that the interplay of nature and nurture is infinitely complex, and that even the most controlled studies cannot account for the unpredictability of life. For Elyse and Paula, each day offers a blend of discovery, connection, and reflection, a reminder of the invisible threads that bind them to a sibling they were separated from for decades. The story challenges our assumptions, confronts our ethical boundaries, and invites us to marvel at the delicate balance between biology, experience, and chance. It lingers in our consciousness because it is more than a story of genetics or science. It is a story of human resilience, curiosity, and the profound mystery of what makes each of us who we are. And as we sit back, ponder, and imagine the lives still unfolding in the shadows of separation, one truth remains undeniable. Some mysteries are never meant to be fully solved, and it is in the pursuit of understanding and the connections we forge along the way that the true story lives on, haunting, beautiful, and unresolved.